the modern day work situation of I'm not sure that we've ever been busier, and I'm not sure that we've ever got less done at the same time. We still talk about leadership as an interpersonal game. I'm not
Yes.
rejecting the interpersonal game of leadership, but can we see that as something that needs to happen as a necessary condition? But can we acknowledge that actually leadership is making this whole show, this whole system called an organisation, produce the outcomes it needs to? And that's going to require management. It takes a lot of corporate courage to do what makes sense.
Welcome to the Strategy Meets Reality podcast. I'm your host, Mike Jones, and today I'm joined by Adam Thompson, an experienced executive and consultant who helps leaders create real strategy and set their organisations up to deliver. We dive into why organisations are busier than ever but achieving less, why managing the work matters more than ever, and how courageous sequencing, not leadership slogans, is what really drives execution. Welcome. Today I have the fantastic Adam Thompson. Thank you for joining, Adam.
It's a pleasure. No, thank you, Mike.
Before we get into it, would you mind giving a bit of background, a bit of context about yourself?
Quite young, I remember finding my dad ran a small business, and on the bookshelf was his bookshelf was a book, The 1 Minute Manager. And I remember reading that as a kid and just finding it really interesting. And I sort of only realised that a few years ago that maybe understanding what's really going on is something that's always been in workplaces, has always been interesting. And I had a pretty standard corporate career, you could say. I generally did roles that were initially involved in projects and strategy, and then that eventually led to being asked to look after some teams and then departments and then eventually whole businesses. And my last actual salaried role was an executive of the Automobile Club here in Adelaide, South Australia, which is where I am. The same sort of auto club that you find all around the world. But my consistent pattern was I'd be put in charge of something, and my job was to fix it or make it work better. And fixing it as in, what are we actually here to do? And then getting it organised and set up and led so it could actually do it. Then I started coming across some theories about how organisations work. I found those fascinating just because of the idea of there maybe are ways to explain what we're essentially seeing. And after meeting some consultants that were great to work with internally, I decided to have a go at doing what I was doing externally.
I like it. I know you do a lot with strategy. If you don't mind, we're going to focus on execution. So what do you think inhibits them from executing properly?
I've got a really straightforward answer, overload.
Okay.
And this is something that started becoming obvious to me quite a few years ago. And what I've done is I've held it in my mind as an ongoing hypothesis, not one that I can ever prove, of course. And I deliberately call it a hypothesis. It might be true, unproven. But whenever you talk to someone you run into a mate and you say, how's work going? The answer is going to be a sigh. That's how's work going for people. Then if you dig in a little bit as to why, there's too much going on and things feel all over the place and it's stop-start and there's a feeling of being busy and nothing getting done. And when you start looking into some of the concepts of organisations, whether they're modern day concepts that are just starting to emerge or whether they're ones that can extend from decades ago, you'll see a common thing about managing the work. And my hypothesis is the amount of work that any given strategy asks an organisation to do over the next 18 months, I think is reasonable. But the way that's organised, which means the amount of work people are being asked to do today, I think is completely unreasonable. And then when you put all that together, you get the modern day work situation of I'm not sure that we've ever been busier, and I'm not sure that we've ever got less done at the same time. So really, that's what I boil it down to, overload. And my contention is that all the other symptoms pop up from that fundamental brick down the bottom that says overload. And I think all the other symptoms, both intangible, emotional, mental, and all the symptoms in terms of outcomes not being delivered, that's my hypothesis, comes from overload right there at the bottom.
Yeah, I like it. But you said something really interesting. Managing the work. How dare you say that in this world at the moment? Because, God, management is apparently a dirty word, and God forbid someone manages the work because that's so archaic, apparently.
Yeah, one of the videos I put out, I actually titled it something along the lines of "Leadership is not what we need; we actually want management." And the idea of that, I've got a couple of definitions I use that I've gradually evolved, which I think work well for me anyway. I can explain them. Leadership, the ability to get a group to willingly move in the direction needed. So willingly and direction, they're the two things. If you're coercing them to move in the direction, that's not leadership. And if there's no direction, it's not leadership. So willingly in direction, that's leadership. And manage means to make sure the value is there. So in that sense, you might manage a team, but you can also manage a swimming pool if you're making sure that people can swim in it and to have it like that. So if we're talking about actually getting work done, my idea is that people want management. We use the strategy part to explain the work we're doing, why it makes sense, a good strategy makes sense, why the work matters and all that sort of stuff. Then we need to get the work managed, that is organized, so that people can actually do it. We've got a bit of an idea that floats around. It's very popular, the purpose-driven organizational and all that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
I mean, how many organizations do have a genuine purpose that is going to be doing something that's good for the planet? There's going to be a few. But my idea is that people need to know that the purpose they're working for is not unethical. But beyond that, could you explain to me why I'm doing this work, where it goes to, why it matters to that person? And then could you organize it so I could please do that work? And I think that if we
Yeah.
put those conditions in place, we're not only going to get a lot of work executed, but we're also going to have people wanting to work there. But you get something
Mm.
interesting. You talk management and manager. I think management of the work is obviously what I'm talking about here. And one of the most effective and traditional ways to do it is by having a manager. But it's useful to separate those two things. I think everyone would believe that work needs to be managed somehow. The method by
Mm.
which we get that done, that's where a lot of the modern day thinking and discussions is now sitting.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I like that distinction. And you're right. People want to be at work and they want to have the autonomy to do stuff. I think, as you said, about being overwhelmed. I think there's overwhelmed in the sense they've got so many constraints on them. It's like it's easier not to do work than it is actually to do work. And there's so much stuff. Without the direction, it almost becomes like just a opaque, just stuff that they can't work out what needs to be done.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you could look at it this way. You could also say there's a complete lack of constraints. And so what I mean by that is
Mm.
Alicia Guerrero, I've come across her work in the last couple of years, and she refers to enabling constraints. And her
Yes.
classic example of that is a roundabout. So a roundabout constrains, a traffic roundabout constrains the free movement of all the cars, all the drivers. But by constraining those movements, it actually enables the whole system to work better. And I'm sure that
Yeah.
if we're all approaching a crossroad and we know there's about 50 other cars coming from multiple directions, we would all gladly say, please constrain us by putting in a roundabout. It'll help us get through. It's what traffic management is. So we can apply that same thing to work. So what I would suggest is that because we don't have constraints in terms of who can ask who to do what, where does the work come from, what do we need to do, and almost because the word constraint has been held up as a negative, I don't want to be the constraint and all those sort of things, we've actually shied away from the simple act of saying, let's organize, let's manage the work in a way that it can go to people. I mean, imagine this for a scenario. You get to sit there at, let's say we're doing an office type job or a creative job that involves a computer. You get to sit there and it's like a Pez dispenser dispenses you a task. It dispenses you all you need to get that task done. And you are saying, you're good at what you do. Could you please complete that task? And when you complete it, here's what you do with it. But unlike the old school stuff that people talk about, let's also say, and if you'd like to know the context for the task, if you'd like to know why we're doing it, if you'd like to know all the things that fit around it, here's where you find that out, or we're happy to talk to you about it at any time. So we do two things at once. We allow people to get clear on the work they need to do and who they're doing it with one at a time, but we also provide the context and the ability to say, what do you think of that work? Does it make sense to you? That way we can have the best of the modern day self-organizing world, which is people actually having the ability to talk about, this is what I think the work should be, this is what it is. But we also get the benefit of the management by saying, but we're not going to ask you to do 500 things at once with about 10 different people asking you to do it. We're going to make it clear, this is what we want you to be doing now. And that's the way I think we can set up organizations to really get things done. It's through deliberate management.
Yes. And on the face of it, it sounds so simple, but so many organizations, organizations struggle with it. And it comes to that idea of initiative. And we want people to take the initiative, but we don't give them the enabling constraints or even the direction to understand that, yeah, they've asked me to do this in order to achieve this. And if they know that, they can take the initiative because they can see, actually, they've asked me to do this, but I could probably do this better, and that will help not only achieve the task, but help the next order affect.
And it is simple, or a way to describe it is I use the term, it's radical common sense. If we want work to
Mm.
get done, how about we actually make it clear so people can get the work done? But I'm never implying simple's easy. And I remember once reading a
Mm.
thing that climbing Mount Everest is simple. Whenever you're faced with a decision, choose the one that goes up. But that doesn't mean climbing Everest is easy. But
Yeah,
there's
I
also
like
another
that.
thing I remember I heard once. Someone said, what was the expression? Someone had said once, I've decided to become a Christian. And the answer was so soon. Because the idea is, and the other way you could put it like this is to say something like Christianity is a good idea. Has anyone actually tried it yet? And what I'm getting at by saying those things is I find a lot of the time if we present these ideas to say, this is what we can do, it's quite simple, it's surprising how often people will argue that it's not that simple as opposed to actually trying it. And the common
Yeah,
effect is as soon as we actually try it, so what you were talking about there in terms of creating that freedom and ability for people to talk about it, and you introduced me to Stephen Bungay's work, The Art of Action. And I thought
yeah,
that was
great
brilliant
book.
because that actually talks about deliberately getting people together to go through what the work is and have discussions with it as a sense making exercise. But can you picture that? You actually say, we're going to do a strategy execution workshop. You get the 7 top executives in the place. You hand them out pieces of paper and pens, literally, not even computers, and you say to them, right, I'm going to spend a half hour telling you how to write out your work so it's clear, and then you're going to spend the next 2 hours doing it. What do you think the reaction would be to most executive teams for a workshop? And therein lies the problem. Yet the irony is there anything more important for an executive team to do than to sit there and get clear on what they think the work should be to then generate a conversation about that same work?
But as we know, Adam, the cynic in me is going to say that the more ambiguity they can create, the comfort they have, because if things go wrong, it's not their fault.
Yeah, but they're also sitting there with a board above them, and the board is going to be saying, "Why aren't you doing more?" Remember the classic thing Eli Goldratt talks about that if you've just spent in a factory $3 million on a new machine, and that machine's sitting idle because if it was operating, it would just clog up the rest of the system. The person who invested in that machine is going to yell at you saying, "Why is that machine idle? I paid $3 million, get it going." And so even though we'd like executive teams to do it, there is the case that they've got pressure on them to say, what do you mean you're sitting there spending a day with a pen and paper writing it out? Should you be doing that? So it takes,
Mm.
I call it corporate courage. It takes a lot of corporate courage to do what makes sense. And I find
Yeah,
sometimes a lot of my work isn't explaining what needs to happen because we all kind of know it. But a lot of my work is to actually give people the confidence to say, if you do this, which seems obvious, it will actually make a big difference.
yeah, and I like it in that Art of Action by Stephen Bungay. He's using principles of mission command and essentially our orders process in the military. And in our orders process in military, what happens is that the commander gives direction, and then we give the next level down the time and space to assimilate what is being asked, work out the plan to then back brief the commander. Say, I've heard what you said. This is what I'm planning to do. And they can go, well, yeah, that sounds aligned to me. That's cool. Or even you can go, well, I've heard what you said. I want to do this, but I'm constrained by this. Are you happy to remove that constraint for me? And I can achieve these outcomes. And I think it's great because it gives you that alignment, it gives you that clarity, and it gives you that order, a sense of what's really important. What's the outcomes and outputs that I need to achieve? I think it just sets the standard for execution.
It's fascinating, and I'm really pleased that you suggested that book to me last year because he positions these ideas as an antidote to complexity. And to me, that was a really unique insight. And to go through the history of the Prussian army and how they were defeated due to their own rigidness and how they looked at their whole way of operating. And maybe we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves as an organisation because this debate went on for 5 decades. So to try to get to it, but yeah, but presenting as an antidote to complexity, I think that was a bit of genius and a great insight to say if we are going to be asking people to respond to what's coming at them, and so you go to the classic example, the retail store being able to respond to what its customers want, providing that context around them and what the purpose is actually enables them to do that. Whereas traditionally, if we want to hold to almost a hardline attitude of all management is bad, it's going to be assumed that people are going to require that shop to put things back upstairs again to say, am I allowed to sell green t-shirts? And it goes back down. Whereas
Mm,
the idea of the mission command or the commander's intent is to actually create that freedom. And I think that's an important insight. And the other big one that I got from Stephen Bungay's work is the concept of it's a sense making conversation. So even though they're called orders in the military, when it does work effectively, as we see in special forces teams, the idea is a sense making conversation based on a document that we can use to both get on the same page. And the analogy I like to use is a homeowner and a builder because the homeowner doesn't assume I'm a better class of person than the builder and I need to talk down to you. And the builder's definitely not going to assume that in the other direction. But the builder has the skills and the expertise. The homeowner has the initial vision and the resources. And together we have a conversation until we arrive at a plan that we can execute. And then, as we all know, a good homeowner will check in to say, have you got what you need and that sort of thing. But if the homeowner gets in there and starts telling the builder what type of nails to use, we're going to have an issue. On the other hand, if the
Mm,
homeowner's seeing things that's making them wonder, it looks like you're putting on a third bathroom and I only need one bathroom, then that gets raised. And if we do have two adults, it works well. And I think therein is one of the other keys to what makes an organisation successful. It does rely on us all doing the work of showing up as adults and not parents and children.
yes.
And that's a lot harder than we think.
Yeah, definitely. When in organisations you've created that or taken that control so much that you've removed the freedom of action for people, so you create that learned helplessness,
Yes. Yeah.
which
Yeah,
obviously doesn't
but,
help.
but but remember, there's an attraction to learn helplessness as well. And Peter Block actually, his work is brilliant. He refers to it almost as a collusion between the dominant leader, and dominant doesn't just mean what you might expect for dominant. It can also mean generating loyalty, stick with me and you'll be okay. You've got that type of leader. Then you've got the dependent team member, and in both situations, both parties have the security of control. The dominant leader says, you will do what I want, so I'm in control. And the dependent gets to say, well, it's not my problem because you're telling me what to do. So it takes both of them the willingness to step into the anxiousness of starting to take accountability together. And that's a lot more work than it sounds like for a lot of people in the workplace.
Yeah, I don't know if you see it. I see it where there's that lack of clarity around who does what. You alluded to earlier around that, management of the work. You do this, and this is what we expect from outputs and outcomes. And I think sometimes people look too much at behaviour first and not structure.
Yeah, and I was actually chatting to a friend and colleague I do work with, and we were actually discussing just how much a lot of modern day leadership. He'd been to a couple of things recently where before going to the thing, everyone had to fill in their survey. And even one of the events he was at, this is a bunch of CEOs. They were all given badges to indicate what color person they were. Like you're the aggressive.
God.
That I know it's still going on in this era. But as much as we say it's the systems that affect the way people behave, and everyone will generally nod to say that, at the same time, we still talk about leadership as an interpersonal game. I'm not
Yes.
rejecting the interpersonal game of leadership, but can we see that as something that needs to happen as a necessary condition? But can we acknowledge that actually leadership is making this whole show, this whole system called an organization, produce the outcomes it needs to? And that's going to require management, which in turn requires intervening at the right moments to get the show to work. Of course, we need to have interpersonal relationships. That's because we're humans. You can't be an asshole.
Mm,
Otherwise,
yeah.
work happens through relationships, so it's necessary. But the idea of that's the game, that's just crazy, I think. But I think there's a certain
Yeah.
attraction to that because we all love reading gossip. We all love seeing what's going on. Like the world is about seeing who's doing what. Even professional sport, it's equally as much fascinating for the gossip as it is for the actual sport. So that's the stuff we're used to. And it does have a place, but I think it has a very dominant place, which I don't think helps.
No, I think that's great insight. And I think you're right. That interpersonal does matter, but it's not the whole piece. There's more to it.
Necessary, but not sufficient. It's a necessary element, but it's not sufficient because, put it this way, I don't want a pilot who's a great person to deal with who can't fly a plane. Simple as that. And the pilot's accountable for returning people to their destination well. And anyone who's got the authority to change a whole system, you're accountable for making sure that people arrive and then go home from work well. They're not damaged by the way
Mm,
you've organised the place for work to occur. And so, so that's a big part of it. And to put it another way, if you ever ask a group of people, assuming the person's not actually an asshole, but would you like someone who's a bit gruff and a bit direct who runs this place brilliantly? Or would you like someone who's the best person in the world who runs the place all over the shop? And we all know what the answer is going to be there.
yeah. I think people talk about that nice leader, but that nice leader's is not going to be very effective for very long, or you're not going to think that leader's very nice for very long when you're sitting there with no direction.
Well, what I'd say is if your style is nice, be nice. If your style is gruff, without going over the edge into arsehole, then be gruff. But the point is authentic, meaning when you talk, you are saying what you think, the ability to get the message across, the ability to do it with empathy, though. I always say if someone's dogs died that morning, that's not the day to talk to them about their performance, so you got your
Yeah,
basic
yeah, yeah.
empathy as a role in doing it. But it's about nice or not nice. It's about the ability to actually communicate and make the decisions and make the show work. The work of Richard Clayton is really, really quite interesting because what he points out in a lot of his thinking is that successful leaders actually have a high need for power, which is quite interesting. Now we make the assumption when we say words like power that it's a megalomaniac asshole. And that's
Yeah.
not true, as in that's not the assumption to put in place here. But the concept is leaders who are successful generally say, I want to take accountability for making this good for everyone. That's a necessary thing. Now, that sounds uncool. It sounds very unmodern, but it also makes perfect sense if we eliminate the assumption that wanting power means that you're mean and unethical. Now, of course, we see a bit of that, but that doesn't mean that it's always the case. And doesn't it make sense? Like the idea if we're asking someone to take charge and make this whole show work well for us, which of course includes listening to people and getting that sort of view, we're going to want someone who wants to do that.
Yes. And you're hitting up on a really, really good point, because I often hear and read on social media about all power is bad, but not all power is bad.
No, that's like saying all gravity's bad. Like, yes, if you jump out of a plane without a parachute, yeah, gravity's bad. But if you jump out with a parachute, or if you're trying to get a ball to roll down a slope, gravity's pretty good. So, no, and that's all power is, the ability to influence. And we see it in the tangible world and we see it in the intangible world. It's a question about what the power is used for that ultimately becomes a question. But it's a real challenge, Mike. The ability to be accountable for the work of a team, a department, a whole organisation, but to do it in the knowledge that other people are not your subjects. They're also adults that have freedom.
Yes.
And then the ability to make what's ultimately clear agreements, and then to hold people accountable to those agreements, not because you're their king or queen, but because you made an agreement and you didn't stick with the agreement. And we need to talk about this because I'm disappointed. That's an adult workplace. And a lot of people mistake that workplace for some sort of like lavender burning in the corner, flowers, sort of, lovely meditation type place. But a workplace of adults is actually about being clear on promises, saying, I need this from you. Can you deliver it? And the answer being, no, I can't. Okay, tell me why. So it's actually having very adult conversations where people can put their needs on the table and say what needs to be done. And we don't need to blow up hierarchy to do that, because if we look at, let's use the term manager, if the manager says, on behalf of the team, I will make sure we're all clear on what we're doing in the bigger picture. And Peter Block actually calls it a broker and a banker for the team. I will represent us in terms of how we work in the organisation. I will make sure that the funding, or I'll clarify what the funding is. I'll make sure the requirements are clear, and I'll generate the right conversation so we can do that. And we look at that as an act of working for the team. We can now get the great things, because that's a necessary role. Someone needs to be doing that, whether you share it amongst 10 people or you just give it to one. And one way to do it is to give it to that one person. And if they can treat everyone like a fellow adult, and if they can be treated like an adult, then we can actually have a situation that can work really effectively.
Yeah, I think that's, great insight. And I like that idea of that bargaining. This is what I need you to achieve, and this is the resources you got. And you go, well, I kind of need a bit more. And it's having an adult conversation to challenge that, rather than what we see is that horrible trope, do more with less.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
And if we go back to the homeowner-builder analogy, now, if a builder's feeling pressure to keep work going and that sort of thing, they might succumb to saying, yes, it's not deliverable. And we know that that doesn't work in the end. So that's where, if we're seeing that happening, we need to try to help people to say what they're really thinking. But when it is working well, builders will say, that's not possible. What do you mean it's not possible? If your budget's 50 grand, this is what we can do. We can't do that. Now, because of the power differential in organizations, it's easy for the person in the managerial role to actually just force it. And because what they're doing in turn is they don't want to look up above them and have to say, no, I can't do that. So we get this interesting situation where the work is forced down so that the person that has to say no is the person in the chain that's paid the least. And that's one thing that I've got an issue with ethically, because if anyone should wear the pain of saying no, I would like it to be the CEO who's paid the most saying to the board, no, I refuse to do that because it's not possible. Now, that might not work well for them, but to me, they're kind of paid to wear that anxiousness of having that conversation. So I think it's just mean all the way up to unethical to be able to pass it down the chain to some poor bugger who needs the money to be able to actually pay their mortgage, and you're forcing them to have to say no. They're not going to say no because they need to keep their job to pay the mortgage. And now we've created a situation of pain.
And I think there's another element to that as well, where the leaders there and the board's mental model of what actually happens down on the ground, you can question, are they actually disconnected from reality? And then thus they don't understand the art that they're doing is just ridiculous.
Yeah. I've seen examples of exceptional CEOs where they've been able to show reality And I'm talking about showing reality by getting everyone together on a Saturday afternoon in a big room that's got a whiteboard and the CEO and the CFO up there with the board drawing boxes and saying, this is this bucket, this is this bucket, here's what happens, and that sort of thing. So I've actually seen efforts put in, not just doing another report, but actually working together. And I always say, if we use the analogy of planning a camping trip, and you've got 4 in the group that say we should be doing this, if you can just get up to the board and explain this is why what you're asking for is impossible, generally we can work it out as humans. So again, we get to that question of, the irony, Christianity is a great idea. It's a shame no one's ever tried it. Like, all these things are great ideas, and people say, but I can't get the board to understand. And I'll say, tell me how you've tried. And it falls over pretty quick. Well, we wrote a paper. Okay. And I've never heard a situation where we all got in a room together, we spent 3 or 4 hours, maybe on a Saturday afternoon, out of work, to just nut it out. Whenever I hear that's happening, it's consistently, it's either things are a lot better, and sometimes it's even a silver bullet. It's never been, what a waste of an afternoon.
Yeah. And it's come back to your point about common sense. People the leaders, the board, must realise that regardless of size of the organisation, there's always limited resources.
Yeah, what's going on is that point that I was making a bit earlier on. When they look at the total budget, they look at the total number of people, and they look at the work, it is actually possible if you expand it over 18 months, 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah,
So that's
yeah.
what they're seeing. So when they're told we don't have enough resources, their brains are quite correctly saying, what do you mean? But if you say to it like this, we're asking people to carry 20 pavers at once. The most any one person can carry is 2, but if we lay them out laterally, we can actually be able to move there, then it makes more sense. So the big disconnection is in the concept of time. And it's that, or even that real simple idea of, if I paid all that money for that machine, why isn't it working? So boards, they want well. Eli Goldratt himself actually says most of the issues in an organisation are because people are good. The board wants to do well by its stakeholders. Come on, get work going. The CEO wants to do well, doesn't want to disappoint the board. So because people ironically want to do well, we end up just loading everything in at once. And it's exactly the same as trying to get people onto a bus. We're basically getting everyone to crowd around the door. We're saying fight for resources, and we're not actually getting them lined up. And then people say it's impossible to line up the whole organisation. I'll say, yeah, well, why don't we just try 20%? Why don't we pick the thing that's on the top of the list and at least try to get that to go through? And that can help to break some of that gridlock to get it through. And another great metaphor we get from nature is simply, if you think about logs back in the days coming down the forest, and it was literally the job of the person to run around on top of the logs with a stick to move them to get the flow going again, because the logs literally get jammed. And that's what we're talking about, exactly the same concept in terms of work. And no, you don't need to put in the ERP to figure that out. We don't. We just simply need to get together and put some stuff on some wall, the dreaded post-its or anything like that, and just make some decisions about what we want to see moving through next. But I'll tell you the irony, Mike, even when you get that clear, the cultural norm of, yes, but I've got to get the next thing moving. I've seen CEOs that have said to people, this is the project I want to see done next. And when they've inquired politely, I'm just wondering why that hasn't been finished yet, I was working on the other 5. And these people aren't idiots, and nor are they lazy, but the cultural norm of, if you've got a second free, get something else started, it's so hard to overcome. And that's a big reason why we're in this work situation we are.
Yeah, so much stuff is firing off from that. Thinking about military, not because I'm ex-military, but we have a thing called main effort.
Yeah.
So we indicate that as the single most important thing to unlock the success for everything else. We must do that, and we resource that first, and anything sequentially after, which I think highlights your previous point. But also, when we talk about this overwhelm or overburden, we know then that creates not only a lack of capacity to use initiative or to collaborate or to look at what's going on and adapt so you're not getting surprised, but it also creates well-being issues. But we don't, all these things, these so-called well-being experts that I see on social media, I don't see them not like talking about, what you're talking about, let's sort the structure out, let's sort the workload out. They're talking about, surface level things. And it amounts to, now we're going to do tabletop yoga, or we're going to do this stuff. And all it's creating is these people are going to do that thinking, well, I'm away from now, and I'm going to have to go back to the 100 odd emails that are just stocking up now because you've got me doing this other thing that's not actually going to help me.
Yeah, I think you're right. And resilience and wellness and the like, it's definitely got a place. And the place for it is, let's say the work is actually well organized, that people are able to focus and spend their time delivering and the like. But there's going to be periods of time where, because of, and especially if it's an organization that's doing social good, there's just a lot of it. But be really,
Mm.
I need to be really clear. It's a lot of it in terms of what's lined up. So it's be like working the service deli at a supermarket and then knowing that there's a lot of people lined up, but you're still serving them one at a time. You can't be any more efficient than that. But that can be stressful. And so we need to be resilient in those moments. The other one can actually be in moments of trying to work out what should we be doing. So that's a separate thing to getting it done. And there's the state of the world and trying to work out what's the best course of action. That can be very much anxiousness producing. And I use the word anxious, by the way, deliberately to separate it from anxiety, which is a treatable condition that needs to be respected. But I'm talking about anxiousness and worry. And it's definitely got its place. When, however, we are putting it in place because we are mismanaging the organisation, so that's causing the stress, that's where we get the irony that I think that you're talking about. And so, yeah, and
Yeah.
that's the equivalent to getting people to run with a rock in their shoe and then teaching them how to get over the pain of having a rock in their shoe when we could just be removing it. So,
I
but
love
remember,
that.
as you
I
said
love that.
at the start, so many management's so uncool. Like, how many LinkedIn posts do you see? Management's what we need. Could we stop this leadership rubbish? That's not going to be a very popular post. But if you write something that
No.
words that basically say leadership's cool and management's rubbish, that will get a lot of likes and a lot of traction on LinkedIn. And here's the way I tend to look at it. Management's what we need to make sure the show runs well. If we can, the more we can move to managing it together, the more effective we're going to manage it. And we need leadership from time to time. But you can't lead the whole time. There's leadership moments. You hear it in terms of customer moments, in terms of that type of thing. It's the same with leadership. There are moments of leadership, and they're often the moments where someone who has really got the capability in the role can tell, I need to have this conversation now, or I need to do this, or I don't need to do that. So there's moments of leadership, key conversations, key things that get put out, but that's not
Yeah.
something that you do all the time.
Yeah. Because we often talk about leadership being the moral element and management being the physical elements. It's like
Yeah, I
the
guess we could put it that way. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because that still moves leadership into the moral, as in into the intangible and that sort of thing. I say being ethical is a
true,
necessary
true.
condition because people can't trust someone who's fundamentally unethical, which to me means not considering the views and impacts all around you. But the other part is leadership, getting people to willingly move in the direction needed. That's going to be tangible. We need to be over there,
Yeah,
or at
yeah.
least go in that direction as well.
Mm. But you see, well, I'm trying to think now what the actual statistics is, but I'm sure it's in like the high 80s, if not 90% um, of employees are unsure of the direction of the organisation.
Yeah. Now, there's two parts to that. Some of it does come from it being too confusing. You have too much of the generic thing. And in a well-meaning attempt, people don't realize mission, vision, and values came from consultants in the 80s. And I'm not saying that the
Yes.
concept's rubbish. It can be useful to know, here's the future we'd like to move to. Here's why we exist. I'm not saying that stuff's useless, but it almost got locked into a generation that mission, vision, value is the same as a house needs a foundation before you put the walls up. It was just invented probably by people like me who said this is a cool concept. So that's one of the starting points. But the idea of saying, here's why we exist and here's what we're trying to get done, that has value. The other thing is this, though. There's a concept in maths called an asymptote, a line that curves and gets closer and closer to the other line but never quite touches it. Clarity is an asymptote. In other words, it will never hit 100%. So there's a point in time where we have none, that's true, but a little bit of clarity, if you think about a line that's exponential, a little bit of clarity goes a long way towards making things a fair bit clear. To then, it's like the 80-20 rule, to then spend the next 6 months rolling out some sort of thing, we're better off to say to people, hey, you've actually got the clarity you need. Now, do you know what work your team's here to do and what you're here to do? And I think when people are saying we need more clarity, that's code for saying, could someone please sequence the work that I've got coming up and explain what it actually needs to look like so I can get on and do it? I think that's what they're saying, but it looks like they need more clarity because what they're hunting for is some way to say, what do I need to do next?
Yes. And I think that's really crucial when you think about synchronizing of a bit like we were talking about earlier with all the stuff that he's doing. Yes, when you look at it one way, they have the resources, but actually, if we synchronize it all out, we can see the interdependencies, the conflicts that you've got. And I think there's that bit of that lack of synchronizing all the work and giving that direction. And you talk about mission visions. To me, a mission is a very clear thing which is not really used. So how I know mission is completely different to how it's used out in civilian organisation.
For you, a mission is something, it's a box that can be ticked at the end.
Yes. Yeah. You are to do this in order for us to achieve this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And someone like me, I could be wanky about it and say, my mission is to make every organisation in the world better. That's not happening. That's not happening. And I don't need some sort of mission. I like being able to help people and get paid to do it. And I'm honoured and I value the fact that they asked me to do it. I don't have anything greater than that. And I'm actually okay with that. And I think a lot of people in their job, maybe their mission is, could you be clear on what you want me to do so I could finish it and go home, please? And if that's the case, let's go. Let's be clear on what we want people to do so they can. And for those that want a higher purpose, we can go as far as you want. Like, let's say you got the people who run the power network in a given area. We can make the purpose up to human life, because without electricity, we don't have surgery maybe and that sort of stuff. Or you can say, you know what, it's cool to get the transformer fixed, whatever. There's an important point that I think Peter Block makes, which is when people say, what's in it for me? The answer actually can be, I don't know, which normally raises a bit of shock. But what that's saying is, I don't know really who you are, and I don't know what purpose you can find in the work. I can tell you why the work needs to be done, but who am I to tell you your purpose in this work? I'm just another human alongside you. And I reckon that's a really interesting and deep point. But notice how much that goes against the narrative, because if you say that to people, they'll say, well, that's not acceptable. The boss needs to provide a purpose, which puts us back to, okay, dad or mum, give me my purpose, please, which therefore robs people of their ability to actually get the work done.
And there is a part as well is around what sort of erodes clarity is because we're trying to make something for everyone.
Yeah, it's a good point.
And sometimes when we're doing strategy, it's just not going to involve everyone. And if you're not directly mentioning it, that means you just carry on doing what you're doing and do it really well. But actually, the strategy means that we need to or reduce the cycle rate here, or do something different over there. But you just need to carry on doing what you want. And this is where I wonder where strategy gets. I always say this all the time. I think strategy gets confused with marketing and PR rather than what it is, which is clarity of direction, so that you can assimilate that and then understand what's implied and what's explicit, what you need to do to enable that to happen.
Yeah, and if we focus on execution, we can actually say strategy is in service of making sure that the efforts of all these people in our organisation isn't being wasted.
Yes.
When servant leadership popped up with, was it Richard on a Greenleaf in the 70s and that sort of thing, and again got mistaken into, a couple of decades worth of happy HR into I'll do whatever you need, I'll serve you. And there's so many HR people I know, by the way, who are exceptional at it, who don't take this view that I'm sort of being a bit disparaging about, but it got turned into I'll do whatever you want. But if you think about serving your fellow humans, which is in both directions, strategy serves the front line by making sure that the front line's efforts isn't doing something that's not needed. So if we want, I'm not saying it's the way, but we can definitely frame strategy as in service of execution by saying, and if you think about a family business, if a family business was doing something that we could tell is not going to be needed in 10 years' time, but our mission was to keep everyone employed, we would start saying, okay, what can we do here? What's going to be needed in the world? And in other words, strategic thinking, right? That's what we would do. It's always an interesting point, isn't it? That I've always wondered, if you adjusted CEO and executive salary, that if you had to make redundancies occur, then that percentage is how much your salary goes down by. I wonder if that would change the idea of our job is to maintain full employment of our people. Therefore, strategically, we need to find areas of value where we can get funding coming in to thus make us a viable organisation. So if you think about that, you get an interesting angle on strategy, isn't it? Because the job is now to keep all 1,000 of us or 100 of us or 30 of us employed, but doing valuable stuff, not stuff that's not needed.
No. And you would start to see leaders really understand this idea, like you just said there, about a viable organisation, one that is self-organising, self-creating, so that it can keep living, but also all these special projects and this other thing that just seems to balloon in organisations. There'll be a lot more scrutiny about actually what are they there for and are they adding the value that they should be.
And remember, they pop up, as Eli Goldratt says, because of the goodness in people. So I remember I worked with a group once, and I often point out, I'm not a process improvement expert, as in I'm not the guy that pulls your data, looks at it, and then comes back to say that. I know some people here in Adelaide that are brilliant at that. Their businesses been going for a decade. They're brilliant at, like, they will find you the customer experience triggers that get it up, or the cost and that sort of stuff. What I often say is I'm the person that can help your team look at the data it needs to look at, so that then over time you'll understand the work and you'll make those improvements. So it's kind of like it may be the same end result, but in a different way, and mine takes a bit longer. But I remember we actually worked out, we put up all the graphs of the way the process worked, and then we noticed that one of the steps of the process, that shape of the graph reflected the end-to-end time, which tells you, obviously, that's the step in the process that's having the impact directly onto end-to-end time. And that was a great insight. And I didn't know, I knew that it's important to find that I call it the pace setter, or the barista in the coffee shop point that can do it. But it never occurred to me to put up 7 different graphs of each step, a graph of each step, and then see which one reflects the bigger picture. It seemed obvious in retrospect. So obviously it becomes, okay, leave that person alone, let them work on what they're working on so they can make it better. Everyone agreed. The very next day, this really smart person went to that person with a laptop saying, hey, when you're working on that, could you have a look at this, please? So despite having the executive in the room, despite consensus in the room that that's a step we're going to focus on and work on, and knowing the person who's going to be able to analyze it to make that step work better, the very next day someone popped in with, and you know what? The idea they had, it was a really good one, but not now,
Yeah.
mate. But how do you say to that person, well, could you just do nothing for the next week? That would be weird for them as well. And so that's where we get
Yeah.
the situation in organisations which creates overload. I'll give you a good example. If you take education departments, and I know from the one here, are full of people who are smart and they care and they're capable and they know about education. It's really inspiring. Here's the trick. Any idea about education is generally going to go in through a teacher. That's the point, because basically everyone in head office is the equivalent to engineers in the factory who have ideas about how the factory could work, but eventually it's going to have to go through the person who. And remember, teachers are highly capable, exceptional people themselves with their own ideas about what to do and all that sort of thing. And they're teaching a class of kids and all the special needs these days and all that sort of stuff. So it's intense. So how do you say to a group of people who've got great ideas, that's fantastic, about one of them we're going to implement each year? That's the challenge, right? But unless the
Yeah.
teacher can change the way they're teaching, which requires them to learn it, to agree with it, to be trained on it, it can't change. So that's a classic situation you get in so many public service organisations. Brilliant people, smart ideas, passion. They're all trying to ram them through together because they care, because of the goodness in them. And there's always a point where that person's saying, that's cool, but I'm flat out trying to make the coffees here. And your ideas, you've all got 20 ideas about how I can make the coffee differently, but I'm busy making the coffee and I can handle one new idea per year.
Yeah. Yeah. But, some of this, as you mentioned about you putting up the graphs and everyone identifying that because they step back from the fog to have a look at that. And, we talked earlier about Stephen Bungay's work and, having the execs in the room to actually step back and work it all out. Do you think that's a challenge there, that we just get zoned into the work and no one's actually taking a step back to think about how it's all being orchestrated?
So what if someone in the group said, hey, we're all probably going to get stuck into the work. It's natural because we care and we're humans. How about I'll make sure that on behalf of us, I'll keep an eye on the bigger picture. I'll make sure from time to time we get information, we look at the bigger picture. If things don't seem to be working, I'll bring it up into conversation. If it seems like it's one of you in particular who might not be going down the right track, how about I'll just come and have a private chat to you? I reckon a lot of groups say, yeah, that sounds like a useful role. Well, what do we call that role, mate?
Unicorn, mate.
And that's the irony is, I think if you have a big self-organizing show, that role which I just described, which is a manager, that's what's going to emerge. But the difference is it
Yes.
might emerge as an adult to adult role as opposed to being so. And the classic example, this is again what Peter Block talks about. If you're a group of partners in business together, you might have a managing partner, but a partner would not go and sign their fellow partners up for training and then inform them that that training is compulsory. A partner would bring to the people to say, the fellow partners, hey, I found this, what do you reckon? And if that partner felt that it was really necessary for them to get the work done, then they need to make the case that it's necessary to get the work done. But remember, this is the part that's often missed in the self-organizing sort of viewpoints. The requirements are locked in. So it is not optional that once a team has been given or signed up to say, this is what we will deliver in the next 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, those requirements are locked in. So if the team is saying we can deliver without that training, okay, but we've agreed that's going to happen. You're an adult that made an adult decision there. And that becomes a thing. So that's the key part of it, is the managerial role, whether it's done by a manager or by a group, is to clarify those requirements, to make it really clear about, in return for these resources, which is usually going to be money in the form of salary and sometimes equipment and stuff, in return for this, we'll deliver that. And now we have ourselves an adult workplace, which takes us back to the homeowner and builder. And that's how we can get an effective organisation put together, if we do the work to have adult conversations and then create clarity and actually manage the work itself. And here's the irony, by doing that
Yeah,
very almost obvious stuff, I think if you do the basics right, I think you move straight into the top 10% of workplaces worldwide.
yeah, I don't disagree. I think that's a really valid point around the importance, I think, of that role, and that's self-organizing, because a lot of organizations are predicated on the fact that everything's stable, everything's predictable, and nothing's going to move from when we decided it is, but it's not going to. And I think what you've really highlighted over this talk is the fact that if we keep overwhelming people, keep chucking things in, we think that we're adapting, we think that we're doing more good stuff, but we're just reducing the capacity for us to actually adapt to what is really important, to the actual shifts that are happening in the external environment. And we just create that internal entropy that creates so much chaos that we can't do anything. We're just locked in, we're too rigid.
And we can't move, because if you're reading 10 books by reading 10% of each book each time, and then we've detected something that needs to change, when you lob the 11th book in, it just goes into the mix. Whereas if we're reading one book because we need to ship that one, then read the second one, if something's changed, we can remove books 4 and 5, flip the others back, put that book at the front now. So that's the irony of, if we go right back to Stephen Bungay's work in the Prussian army, by being skillful at being clear on the work, and not just skillful in articulating it, but skillful in having the sense-making conversation, we become super agile because we're good at changing the work very quickly. And that's the irony of it. By actually
Yes,
focusing
yes.
on clarity of the work, we become more agile, not less. And I think that, in a way, that's where it takes corporate courage to actually see that and believe it and put it into action. Whenever it is put into action, by the way, works well.
Yeah, yeah, I could attest to that as well. And I think such a great analogy to use, and really highlights what we actually need in this sort of volatile organisation. But it's just, like you said, it's that courage to step back and realise that the paradigm that we're using or the mental model we're using to navigate organisations, has good intentions, but is it really suited for what we're trying to actually do?
And I reckon the good intention part, I'm glad you highlighted that, Mike, because it's too easy to get together, and consultants do it as well. Oh, bloody clients, why they're doing that, like all this sort of carry on. And it's not done with this underlying assumption of they're all decent people trying to get stuff done. And yes, some people might be a bit lazy and might produce less, but I reckon it's definitely below 5%, probably 3 or 2% genuine arseholes, proper dysfunctional in the workplace type thing. And we all of that comment, everyone rocks up to do a good day's work. Maybe not even that, but we do know that if we can set up the show so that it makes sense, we're giving it our maximum chance. And then it becomes fair or ethical to say to people, hey, I don't know if you're getting the job done here, but until we've actually set up the system and by the way, good enough, not perfect, as long as we've set up the
Yes, it's good
system
enough.
so it's relatively clear in terms of we need you to do this now by then, and here's who you work with. If we've got the good old fashioned boring management in place, but we're managing like adults to adult and not managing like sovereign to subject or parent to child, that's how we can get that sort of thing done.
Yeah, I like that, and I like the fact you put in that it's not perfect. It's good enough, and I think we need to move away from this idea of perfection, and I think must be a certain way.
When I say good enough as well, I always point out if we're watching the dials on a nuclear reactor, good enough is pretty close to perfect. If we're
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about me putting together a proposal for a client and I'm obsessing over a particular word in it and it takes me an hour to do it, that means I'm going too far past. So when I say good enough, I actually mean good enough depending on the context, because it's easy to assume good enough means a bit shit. Whereas, no, what I'm
yeah,
saying
yeah, yeah,
is
yeah,
good enough is good. But that's what happens in the sense making conversation. What does good enough look like and all that sort of thing. And so that's what it comes down
yeah,
to. It's a natural thing to say, but we haven't got time to do all that. And that's true if you're trying to do everything at once. But
yeah,
if we do work out, and that becomes the key, we can't do everything at once, but just because we're not doing it now doesn't mean we won't get to it.
yeah. And I think I'm glad you mentioned time, because that sort of aligns to what we're talking about. That in execution, people forget about time, we're trying to do things at a certain time, and I think that sort of mediates that good enough, because it's good. It's at a really good standard. Yes, we could probably spend another 5 weeks doing all this stuff, but we ain't got 5 weeks, so that's good enough because we need to do that in that time.
And we do work in that way. We do it personally if you procrastinated about doing the board paper and it's just due at the end of the day, and we work in a focused way. And we can even do it organisationally. We saw that through COVID. It's not like IT departments magically grew the capability to get everyone working on video from home, but they were finally, two things happened. They were given one thing to do, and
Yes.
the standard was just get it working, and then we'll figure out the rest later. So because IT was given that, what do you know? IT departments around the globe nailed it. They got everyone working from home within 5 days. That's a hell of an effort. But I reckon if you're in any IT department, it's like, yeah, that was hard, but we knew what to do. We just were left alone finally.
Yes.
And that's what we can learn from that experience.
And I think that's such a great thing. It's amazing what you can get done when you give direction and focus, and give people the resources to do what you need to do, and just give them the space to do it.
Yeah, but you'll see so many ironies, to use that common sense idea again. Some IT departments will put some sort of demand manager role up the front. The irony is that's living in the IT department. And I'd say, look, they have a say, they've got insight, but how are they supposed to know? What I would do is I'd put that squarely in front of the CEO and their exec team to say, if the rate of IT development is actually the rate of change in our organisation, which is often going to be the case these days, then it makes sense that the executive team is sequencing the work into there. Not every tiny detail, but basically saying that before that, before that, listening carefully to what the CIO says is capacity and actually believing them. And then what you'll see is the throughput increases, change happens quicker because, again, we're not completing 10% of each book at a time. We're completing a book, completing another book, completing another book. So change starts to happen versus nothing happening for 18 months for 2 years. So that's where, if you've got that crucial area of the organisation, which is often going to be technology, it doesn't make sense to have some poor bugger who's sort of maybe 1 or 2 levels removed from the front line trying to manage demand of the whole show. Give it to the exec team, because that's the key thing. And you know what? The irony is, in professional sport, the coach sits there because it's the coach's job to work out what's going on, that it's not actually working. The coach wouldn't say, oh, can someone else go and work out the sequence, please? I'm too busy doing other stuff. So in a lot of industries, we can make sense of it. And it just, again, it takes corporate courage and a willingness for an exec team to say, we'll take hold of that, and no, we're not micromanaging here, because we're not going to tell you how to do development, but we're definitely going to do the managing of the organisation, which is sequence the work in that's going to change the organisation. And you know what? If you put that in front of exec teams, after they get over the initial debates, they're actually really good at it. They just haven't had much chance to do it. And they're still caught up in the culture of we have to get it all going at once. But I come along and I basically and I use various almost verbal tricks. So pretend there was only one you could do. And I'll say, I'm going to annoy you all now. I'm going to make you only choose 2. And then from 2, which one? So there's various tricks you can use, but they're actually quite good at it once you give them the right framing.
Yeah, and I like that no nonsense, common sense approach.
Yeah, and it does work.
I just admire that straightforwardness, that common sense approach. If you were to leave a listener, a leader, with something to think about or to take away from all this about execution, what would that one thing be?
The word sequence.
Oof. Okay, cool.
That's the one. And this might be a surprise. Priorities are an input into sequence. So priorities are a service of sequence. But if you think about an airport, if you've got 2 planes coming in, it might be tempting to say the big A380 with the most passengers on it, that's probably the priority. But maybe it makes sense to land the little Cessna, get it landed, move it out the way. That'll be good to move it on. So sequence, that would be my one word. And then sequence happens on a fractal level. You can sequence the whole change of your organisation right down to sequencing each individual's work. So it's sequence gets us out of overload, but don't underestimate the level of corporate and personal courage it takes to actually choose one thing to get it done. But here's the good news. If you sequence everything, the way you were trying to read those 10 books, you weren't going to get them all done until 10 months anyway. If it's 1 book a month, they're all going to be happening at the last month. So if you're sequencing them, it actually doesn't matter which one you pick first. They're all still going to get done in the same amount of time. But by sequencing it, you'll actually start to see change occurring. So sequence, and the thing I would put alongside that is, when you hear all the arguments in your mind rising up about why your place is different in terms of sequence, ask yourself, that's how much the culture is making me want to resist this idea, because sequencing adds up, but we have so much sitting inside of us that makes us not want to see it. So that's my word, sequence.
Oh, I love it. I think that's a great a great spot to end the conversation. And you keep mentioning books and sequence, and I'm looking aside of me of all these books that I need to read, so I'm going to take that and sort them out. Adam, honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure. And if you've enjoyed the conversation between me and Adam, please like and subscribe and share it to your network so that other people can gain from Adam's straightforward wisdom.
Beautiful. No, it's been a pleasure, Mike. I really appreciate the questions you asked and the way you made the conversation happen. So no, thank you from me as well.